thanks to everyone for turning up and coming out on what is a pretty cold and wet night. This is the official opening of a project that has been in development for a little while. And actually, it's really only the start of it, even though I say the project's been in development for a little while. It's the first proper step in launching the project. Now, we did have a small exhibition of materials last year at a location in Leicester called Beta X. And a number of the artists featured in this exhibition also featured in the Beta X one. But this is the first time, really, it's got a larger cohort of artists, and the work has been done to collect biographical information and artworks and so on. So what we're going to be talking about tonight, and I'd like us to be finished in an hour so that we can grab something to eat downstairs if we want to, and have a chat, this, that, and the other. So let's try and keep it, I will try and keep it to an hour. Right, yeah, grab a seat, yeah. So the exhibition and the project is Leicester Computer Art Pioneers. And this, as I say, is an exploration of Leicester and Leicestershire's computer art history. We have a few questions that come out of an exhibition of that sort. So why do I think that computer art in Leicester and Leicestershire is interesting? I'm going to talk a little bit about that. What is the project that's been initiated doing, and how is it being supported? What are the key narratives that so far have been uncovered, but are ones that I'm exploring as well that maybe haven't been developed quite so well? The exhibition itself, the Leicester Computer Art Pioneers exhibition, the first output of this project, we'll talk a bit about that. The work is in the cafe bar downstairs. This is going to be open for about 3 months, so there's plenty of time to look at it and also to engage with the project, because it's not one way. I want people to feed materials back and ideas. And then we'll have a little look at the artists and their artworks. And there's an opportunity here for the artists who are present virtually and co-present to maybe say a little bit if they want to, completely open. And then I'm going to talk about making connections, which is really my core approach to curating. Whenever I put an exhibition together, certainly if it involves multiple artists or multiple narratives, if you like, I like to understand what the connections might be between those artists and narratives. And the really interesting thing about doing a project that's looking at Leicester and Leicestershire is that they're the obvious narratives. And then, as I'll illustrate, there are sort of other ones, other connections that pop out that maybe weren't that apparent at the time, but they sort of feel a bit more significant now. I'd like to then explain what's happening next with the project. And then we'll talk about the immediately next project, which is New Generations, which is an engagement with contemporary artists looking at this older material. So that's really the plan for what we're going to be talking about. So to answer the sort of first question, so I'm probably going to leave this here until I start doing some demos of websites and things. So you don't have to look up there if you're in the room to see me. I'm here. My head hasn't quite got around the idea that I'm presenting and I'm on the screen. Anyway, so the first thing is, why look at Leicester and Leicestershire from a digital arts perspective? Well, the bottom line, the most important things to say is that because we have a very interesting history. And that interesting history, I make no claims that Leicester is like the home of digital art and where it all happened, but it's as good a place as anywhere to look at, because we do have a fascinating history, and that history is based around institutions and people. And it does continue to this day. There is a great digital art scene in Leicester, very grassroots, but some higher level, bigger initiatives as well. And so I knew a bit about this narrative because I've been lucky enough to work with some of the people, not back in the day, I joined a little bit later, who really were instigating this amount of work. But I knew that the work needed to be explored, and I knew that it wasn't particularly well documented. It is documented in some respects, but there's always more work that can be done, particularly making these connections, which, like I say, is the thing I'm interested in. So the first thing really is Leicester does have a very interesting digital art history. The history that we've tried to capture in this first exhibition is a sort of narrative that began in the late 60s. And it began in the late 60s through two individuals who happened to meet and initiated a program, which I would say is still relevant to today. The work that was being done almost 50 years ago is the sort of thing that as digital artists, we ought to be aware of. In fact, that's a point worth making, and that I don't see this as an exercise in nostalgia. looking at history, certainly for me as a practitioner, as an artist, is never about looking and say, oh, it's great in the old days, didn't they do things nicely then? It's about understanding how you can become better as an artist and recognizing that artists working 50, 100 years ago can be doing things that are still relevant to your practice now, and even more than that, hundreds of years ago. And you can learn from previous practitioners to become a better artist. So that early work in particular was Ernest Edmonds, who's sitting here, and Stroud Cornock, whose partner, is online at the moment, Jenny Cornock. And we had two people working at two institutions in Leicester, the Art College and the Technical College, who, through an interest in art, happened to meet each other. It's a sort of almost like round the water cooler moment, although it was more a case of Ernest looking for somebody in the art college to help support a piece of work that he was creating. We'll see the piece of work when I look at the artworks. And then a meeting of minds happening in the very late 60s, which then developed in the early 70s. So for this particular story that I'm trying to tell, I marked that as the starting point. So Ernest, who's in the room, and Stroud, who sadly is no longer with us, that starting point began something in Leicester that has continued, for the 50 plus years now since it happened. So I always thought that was fascinating. I knew Stroud. I was lucky enough to meet Stroud and have a number of chats with him. I wish I'd recorded them. I wish I'd talked about more things, but that's life. And I also admired his work as well as an artist myself. So we talked about art as well as other things. And then I thought, well, let's trace some of that narrative. I'm not saying that this is the complete narrative, because it isn't. There are 8 artists in this exhibition. There are hundreds of artists within the Leicester digital art canon, if you like. Well, maybe they're not in the canon. That's the problem. They're not recognised. They need to be brought into this. But I felt that there was a story worth presenting, which shows how Stroud and Ernest began this work. Technical colleges then merged into the Polytechnic, so Leicester Poly. And from there, a number of other artists and practitioners were brought in. They were brought in as artists, but they often worked as researchers, doing research into computational art and user interface design, such as, for example, Stephen Scrivener, who's sitting here. We had others represented in the show. I'll take an example of Dominic Borum, who again is sadly no longer with us, but his wife is very supportive of us developing and rediscovering, presenting his work. It's very interesting work. In the 70s, lots of stuff was happening. I've identified those two figures as being key as that part of the narrative. And then if we continue it a bit further, we bring in characters who are involved maybe in the Leicester Poly and beyond work, such as Stephen Bell and ultimately myself. And I'll explain how this sort of lineage works. But as a way of making sure that we don't just focus on a single narrative, no matter how important it might be, I've been lucky enough to make contact with 2 other Leicester and Leicestershire pioneers, one of whom is online, Graham Bates, who was working at the Polytechnic, which became De Montfort University. He was working around that time. And then also another person, Brian Reffin Smith, who doesn't have that local university connection, but has gone on to become a sort of world-recognised artist who was born in Sileby. So we have, as we should have within our narrative, people who were born in the area. And Ernest, you were born in Leicester, is that right? No, you're not born in Leicester. Okay, yeah, born in London. But I think maybe your Wikipedia page needs updating, because I think I read that and I thought, I'm sure that's not right. But we have people born in Leicester, people who've worked in Leicester, people who've studied in Leicester. But it also broadens out to the county as well, because we have Leicester Uni, we have Leicester Poly, now De Montfort University, we have the colleges before then, and then we also have Loughborough University. And a number of people in this exhibition were associated with Loughborough. And I'll try and explain a little bit about how that happened. So I'll swap those 2 around. So what I'm trying to do with the project is, first of all, start to capture some of those narratives, but also develop a collection of artworks by those artists and also associated ephemera. I think it's always interesting to capture the artists, but also what they were doing at the time. So we've been doing interviews and discussions. We've also been collecting materials and photographs. Found a great photograph, which you'll see, soon in the Leicester Mercury from the mid-70s of Ernest in front of some state-of-the-art computer equipment, talking about this idea, crazy idea, that computers might one day talk to us. 50 years later, we're about there. We've managed to just about get there. And this is in the context of education. So AI, computer intelligence in education. So we have this initial collection of things, objects. We have a growing collection of ephemera, books. We're interviewing some of the artists. And I'm also keen on starting dialogues, because I'm 100% aware that the 8 artists in this exhibition are not the complete story. And the more we publicise that Leicester had interesting digital art stuff happening in the past as well as the present, the more stories will uncover. And a criticism of this exhibition is it's 8 men. Well, I've struggled to find women, but I know that they do exist. Women were working in the arts in the 70s. Just looking at some of the photographs that I've managed to find, there was another one in the Mercury. I don't know who the person was. We'll try to find out. Sitting in front of a computer, clearly looked like an artist working with computers in the 70s. So it'd be interesting to try and find out who these people were. And then we do have other people, and I think the name Susan Tebby should be mentioned, who, whilst not a computer artist in the sense that she was not working with computation. Well, no. Okay, she wasn't working with computers, but she was sort of working with computation more in a constructivist way, ought to be brought into this narrative. So I'm looking forward to expanding who we're talking to and maybe the work that we include. So that was really a background of why Leicester's interesting, because there's a lot of interesting history and important people. The project is doing, it's about collecting stuff, and it's about presenting stuff, and it's about developing those narratives. And the narratives themselves, as I've mentioned, there is a central one at the moment, which is really the De Montfort, Leicester Colleges and Art College, De Montfort University, Loughborough University, or Leicester Polytechnic, Loughborough University, and so on. There's a bit of a lineage there, but I think other things will appear. We'll look at adding things that I'm not currently aware of, but people hopefully want to contribute to the project. Will. What might the outcome of this be? Well, it'll certainly be more exhibitions, but maybe we'll look at having a book, Leicester Digital Art History book. And I think what might be interesting about that is, again, not the claim that Leicester is somehow the most special place in the world. Some might say it is, but that we've researched a development of digital arts practice over a 50-year period. And I would say that would be representative of things that have happened elsewhere, certainly in the change of media, change of ideas, and so on. So I almost feel that we could study something local and come up with findings that are relevant nationally and internationally. But on the other hand, maybe the collection just develops and I have more stuff and we do more exhibitions and it doesn't become some big formal academic thing. So what I'd like to do now is really take you through the exhibition, and that will hopefully fill in some of the gaps in the things that I've been talking about. So I now have to stop the share, make sure there's nobody waiting out there. We're certainly on the back of a bit of a nasty cold. My brain is already struggling here, but hopefully we'll be all right. So let's go. Great, I've made the transition. We're on a web page now. Phil, grab a glass of wine and then grab a seat. So let's have a look at the exhibition. So it's worth saying a bit about some of the people and the institutions involved in this, because I'm trying not to do this as a personal project, but to bring institutions in who might want to contribute. And the first of those is the Computer Art Society. Now, the Computer Art Society has been running since 1968. And it's not a coincidence. It's been running since the beginning of this work, because this work and the Computer Art Society and an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, 1968 seems to come across as a very important year. So the Computer Art Society, long-running organisation, is supporting this work. And I think where the Computer Art Society will be valuable, is already proven to be valuable, is helping with the networking and also helping with the dissemination of this work. So this is seen as a co-production with the Computer Art Society, but it's also a co-production with the Computer Arts Archive, which is the Leicester-based project that's collecting all of these materials and giving them a home. There's some exciting news about the Computer Arts Archive that I'll pass on towards the end. But also, we've been lucky enough to get some support from the City Council through the Cultural Ambition Fund. Now, they offer really handy amounts of money, not big grants, small grants that enable you to do things. And in order to really do this project in the way that I wanted to, at least wanted to start doing, I had to travel and meet people and interview them and produce materials and produce a catalogue, which you'll all have an opportunity to get one for free for turning up on a cold night. And so I have to say that the council has been very supportive in enabling this project to happen. So the website for the project is on the Computer Art Society website. And what you see in here is, first of all, great picture showing Ernest, Stroud, Cornock, and a participant in their pioneering artwork. I was going to say data game, data pack. Yeah, okay. So this might not look like an artwork. You say digital art, you may not see this, but actually this is a very early example of an interactive artwork where the computer is the medium through which the participant interacts. And really, you think about interactive artwork now, it's happening through computers in very sophisticated ways, but there are certain things about how people interact and what it means to be interactive that this artwork has and are relevant to now. So we have an artwork 50 plus years old that I would say you should know more about. I need to know more about, is relevant to now. I've written an introduction to this just to put some dates in. I don't want to just list loads of dates, but this provides a sort of history from this initial encounter between Stroud and Ernest, and through some of the institutions and people involved in the exhibition. If you would think about this lineage, I would say Stroud and Ernest near the beginning, and then we have Stephen Scrivener, who's with us, arriving in Leicester as studying in Leicester as an artist and coming back as a PhD student with Ernest. Dominic Boreham, who came to Leicester to study and to work in the Polytechnic, did some fantastic work. We then go through to Stephen Bell, who is more from the late 80s, the period where a lot of the team from Leicester Poly had moved up the road to Loughborough to form the Lucci Research Centre, and an artist, Stephen Bell, was associated with Lucci. And then I managed to squeeze myself in because very luckily, when I was an undergraduate in the late 80s, I met Steve initially because I was always interested in what was known as computer-human interaction and computer graphics. And Steve offered me the chance to work on a final year project that enabled me to explore, by writing prologue programs, how you could interpret images and so on. Again, sort of research 40 years after date, which is still relevant. Some of the things that were done back then, that's the nature of research. And it just so happened that Ernest, it wasn't just so happening, but Ernest was the head of department. So I briefly got to meet Ernest. And then I've included some other additional artists who we mentioned here, Graham Bate, and then Brian Refn Smith, who started off here in Leicester and then on Sarby, and then went off and did great things elsewhere, and has now sort of reconnected a little bit since. So that's the introduction there. And then we have artwork by the artist. So what I'd like to do, and this is all downstairs, is take you through each artist and explain a little bit about how I interpret their work. And then maybe if the artists are in the room or online, they can say a bit if they want to, but no pressure on anyone. So let's start with Stroud. Great picture of Stroud. I think this was photographed in Nottingham outside an exhibition. We have a date there, 1971. So Stroud is one of the originators, really, sadly no longer with us. There is a great obituary written by Ernest, which really talks about Stroud as a person, but also as an artist and the work he did later on, which I won't read out now, but it's available on this website, is public. And what interests me in particular about Stroud's work is, I suppose a major thing is about his interest in systems, because as an artist, my interest is in art systems that are, if you like, processes that can be defined by rules, but are sort of enacted through interaction. And really what Stroud was doing in his late 60s work, despite being a sculptor, is coming up with interactive forms that the viewer, the user, can interact with. So we have some, it's all in the right order, but actually I really ought to say maybe about a Stroud project, one of his projects here. If you look at Labyrinth in 1971, which is a space that you enter the sculpture, right, the sculptural form, and you interact with this through a process of exploration. It's not built using a computer, but it has many of the features you might expect in a computer-based interactive artwork. he worked with Ernest on a computer artwork. They worked on it together called Data Pack, 1969, 1970. That image you saw earlier did use a computer. And some of the material, the ephemera, if you like, from that exhibition includes sort of technical looking drawings and paper tape. You got to keep your data pack after the exploration. And I think this, Ernest, is an image of your data pack. Is that right?
Yeah. But paper tape is actually the program that ran it.
Ah, okay. And so it might be worth you saying a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. So on the top left is one of the drawings that came out. So what happened is someone had a conversation, in quotes, rather like Eliza, if people are aware of the Eliza, and then had a teletype, and you can't read it. On the top right is a transcript of exactly someone's conversation. And that conversation led to a choice about which spaces in this architectural drawing would be allocated to that person. So then this drawing was produced, which was specific to that particular interaction. So what this shows is the top right, someone's conversation, possibly mine, I think, yes, and the image that came out from it. And then below it, there's a description that we wrote about it on the right. On the left is the description of the code that we had to write. And in those days, you didn't type your computer program into a computer at all. You wrote it on forms that you gave in for someone else to type up. And they typed it up onto this paper tape.
Okay. So I've always thought that this paper tape, data tape, had the results of the interaction on, but no, the results of the interaction. Okay, so that's the program.
That is the art.
Yeah. So that's now already we've got in
where the made the artwork is on that paper tape.
Yeah, that again is now an interesting and very relevant question. Where's the art in computer art?
Yeah.
And so already this question is being asked. What is the artwork?
Stroud and I made this piece because we wrote this paper, which was like a manifesto, really, about how important interactive art would be in the future. And we wanted to show, we had the opportunity to show something where we made an interactive artwork that demonstrated that you could make interactive art, even though by modern standards it's kind of crude and crazy, and as you said, you pointed out earlier, you wouldn't recognize it as an artwork. But nevertheless, it sort of demonstrates the principles.
No, actually, that just popped into my head, which is, I think, a really important thing if you're working with a computer, or one important thing, I'm not saying it's prescriptive, is that your artwork should in some sense transcribe or transcend the technology you're using. Otherwise, it becomes old and maybe potentially uninteresting because it's so dependent on the current tech or the technology used.
Maybe I could just add one phrase, which is the thing we worked with, was the concept of technology intersection, which meant that you worked with what you thought would become the technology 5 or 10 or 15 years later. So what you were doing was crude, but it was dealing with the principles that would become more than it.
Great, yeah. So we have some of Stroud's drawings of his interactive and potentially responsive spaces. This picture of Stroud inside Labyrinth. And this image here, which was included because I just think it's a bit of an insight really into the artist's process, but it's an image from the media handling area at Leicester Polytechnic. I think this image is 70. Sometimes I find it difficult to find the exact dates, but oh no, that was 72. So this was what you might think of as a workbench, but this was Stroud producing one of his artworks, and the image happens to capture it in the media handling area.
Sure, may I say something else about Stroud? Because it's a very important figure, obviously. He actually formed the media handling group as soon as he arrived in 1968, because he saw this as something that he didn't know what it would mean or what would happen, but something that we should concentrate on. And it's important to understand that he came from working with Roy Ascott. So Roy Ascott had this influence. Leicester through Stroud.
Yeah, great. So it's another one of these connections that I'll come on to that needs to be explored, really.
Yes.
Now, we have been working with Jenny, and she's actually got a very impressive archive of Stroud's materials. And my ambition, Jenny's online, so she can hear me saying this, would be that we could bring this archive to Leicester and have it stored at the surprise venue, or the venue that I will mention shortly. And for each of the artists, I'm building up web links. So if you want to find out more about them, you can. So you have an introduction to Stroud. There's the first figure here. Now let's move on to Ernest. So this was the picture we found in the Leicester Mercury. So the article is about you developing a proposal to develop computer speaking in education. And it mentions a young researcher who you brought in called Stephen Guest, who I did get to meet at Loughborough University later on. I don't know, do you recall this article being written?
No, I don't.
Yeah. So this is the thing, not everything we want to capture is still remembered by people. We have to hunt around and find out a great picture. I thought I'd like to use it. And Ernest has provided an introduction to his practice and his work, which of course goes on. It's quite rather a big practice. And I've got a few props with me today. If you really want to know more, there is a book called Generative Art Systems by Francesca Franco, which goes into Ernest's history in more detail. Get it from the library or whatever, find it on Amazon. And that will really fill in a lot of the history there. And we have 4 images. This was important to include because, correct me if I'm wrong, Ernest, this is the piece that you were looking for support in realising, painting, and you happened to bump into Stroud whilst doing that. Is that right?
Yes. It was a piece where two things about it. One, it was the first piece where I used a computer program to help me work out what to do geometrically. And secondly, I decided that the piece 20 could be sprayed rather than painted with a brush. And that's when I went over to the art college and asked, have you got a spray booth? And I would do that. And someone said, well, there's this guy called Stroud Cornock and he runs the spray booth. So his multimedia stuff included physical stuff like spraying as well as electronic. And so he helped me by helping to make this piece with his spray booth.
So we have the piece here. And where is that piece at the moment? Do you have it on show anywhere?
No.
Yeah. It's in the studio, yeah. Obviously, it'd be nice to have it physically shown somewhere in Leicester before too long.
Yeah.
And there are some possibilities we could talk about there. And you've seen this image a couple of times. I've used it because it is a great image. But that shows Ernest and Stroud and a subject working on data pack.
So it shows the subject using the teletype in this conversation. And just beside me, you can see the graph was actually drew the drawing.
Yeah.
And over on the left, there's you see that?
Oh, this, yeah.
That's where you put in your paper tape.
Oh, that was the reader. Yeah, so computers in those days, somebody would turn your program into a tape and you would then load it into the computer. This looks like a computer processor, am I right? Yeah, that's the processor. And then you've got this plotter here. And this was at Leicester Poly, as was. You wonder what happened to this stuff. And this is like classic equipment. It probably ended up in a skip or being crushed in a crusher of some sort. And then we've got 2 images here, which you might, if you know Ernest's work, will be more recognisable. I think I'd rather me say, I think you should mention Shaping Space.
Yeah, okay, so that's an interactive work. So those are 2, as you can see, there's a young lady dancing in front of them. So each of those are sheets of perspex suspended from the ceiling and the data projection behind them. So you just see the images in space. And the little bright light you can see at the bottom are actually from cameras. So that the computers driving it are doing 2 things. They're changing the image all the time. And they're also analysing whatever movement is taking place in front of it. and as a result, affecting how the changes take place. So it's kind of interactive, but sorry to go on, but one extra thing, which is that the system is learning, so that it slowly changes the rules as time goes on according to the movement that has been seen. So the work is like influenced in the long term by the behavior of people.
An important thing to say, because the difference between an artwork that responds to you and one that actually changes because of your interaction, learns from you, is pretty profound.
And I believe this is very important.
Yeah. So you press a button on artwork and it does something, and you come back, you press the same button, it does the same thing. It might be responding to you, but it's certainly not learning from you. It's not truly interactive. So if you're thinking about interaction, both parties have to change in some way, you, the viewer, and the artwork.
So I always say when I interact with my grandchildren, that is one of my grandchildren. I hope that I get an immediate response. I also hope that 5 or 10 years later, they might be different because of the interaction.
Yeah, great.
This work tries to deal with that.
And then we move on to the Beijing piece here, which I would describe as classic Ernest Edmonds shaping forms.
So, I mean, to be very brief, these are computer-generated works, but they're actually also in the systems art tradition. So they're using mathematical theories and arrangements to determine the colours, both the colours in terms of the hue, the brightness and the lightness, and also the physical arrangement of the pieces.
Yeah, and I think it's also another important thing to say here is that it's true about a lot of the works that you're seeing tonight, is that clearly we're showing images, we're showing two-dimensional prints, but many of the artworks are fundamentally animated or dynamic and interactive. And there's a simple reason for that. It's much simpler to show prints than it is to show interactive artworks. But the ambition of the archive, and in particular this project, is not just to collect prints, but to be able to show the animated works at some point. So we're going, we're certainly not saying all computer art is about two-dimensional prints and all the artists being featured. I'm not saying the same thing either. Again, some more resources here. I'd like to add to these resources over time, so this page becomes a useful jumping off point for people interested in this group of artists. Now, let's move down here. Now we're sort of, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Just building on that, like, just run Simple Tango based on the for 6 months in Dubai and in Leicester and in multiple places in Leicester. Well, how did the work change from when you installed it and what it ended up as?
Right.
Because I mean that would be a really good. You've already got that data.
Yeah, sure. So Trace is referring to a different kind of work, which is already there, which is where the interaction takes place at the work, but the work exists in more than one location. And those two locations talk with one another. So the one that Tracy was referring to, one part was in Leicester, the other part was in Dubai. And so people were interacting using the internet. They were actually interacting with people in the other city. But all the other things did.
I think there's a lot to be said about that pioneering interactive work.
Another story.
And I would most definitely like to explore that further. Yeah.
But I had to say that, but let's not go into that time. That's another story.
Yeah.
But what we saw change, I think, was quite small in a way, but it was the hues that were changing. So there was a shift of the dominant hues from the strong reds towards not quite to blue, but in the direction of the blue. So that what it was learning, if you like, or responding to all the behaviour that was going on, led in that case to this sort of slight shift of hue. And I don't know how it's going to change because it depends on what people do in front of the work. So I couldn't predict it. But anyway, that's why that's the thing I noticed.
I think as an artist who works with interactivity and responsiveness, so things do respond to their environment. What you really ultimately is, the broad area. It's not going to suddenly turn into pink fluorescent and green stripes. Maybe it could, but I don't, from what I understand, that could never happen. So there's a whole sort of field of possible shapes, but you don't know how it's going to navigate around that space. And that's an important thing for generative art in general, in that often an artist who's creating a generative artwork may not precisely say this, and this are going to happen, but they know the potential space in which the forms might emerge, and they'll navigate around and choose the ones that seem right for them. Let's move on to Steve Scrivener, who's with us as well. Now, Steve's story in brief, and Steve's here, so I was worried, is so your diploma in art and design at Leicester Polytechnic, but was it Leicester School of Art when you did it, that diploma?
No, it's just
it was Poly by then, yeah. Okay, so you're very early on in that period. It probably hadn't been a Poly for long.
No, the Polys weren't there for long, were they?
Yeah, well, sort of early 70s. So I think Leicester Poly.
CNAA, yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So we have this history here working as an artist, so doing your art diploma, but then going off to Malcolm Hughes's department at the Slade. Yeah.
So, well, I knew Stroud, but principally I worked with a guy called Jack Rodway, who ran a little sort of experimental section at the art school, and Gavin Bryce, who is a composer, but was quite a key figure then. Went to the Black Mountain College and stuff like that, so it was quite a figure for us, because he knew John Cage and all that sort of thing. And I started to do experimental work where basically I used natural systems as a way of actually creating images, both based on light and then on water. On the basis of that, I was admitted to the Slade in 1972 into what was then the experimental department, which didn't really last very long. I think it lasted for a few years. And so a bunch of people there who were working in quite experimental ways. And because I was using systems in a way as a basis for creating work, it seemed natural to actually move into using computer programs. So I learned how to program, and I developed an interactive system that wasn't called homeostatic, it was called the machine at that time, but it was based on homeostatic systems. It was based on Ross Ashby's books about ideas for a brain, etc., etc. So I drew on that material. And then when I finished my high diploma, it was then called, at the Slade, Ernest invited me to do a PhD in Leicester. I knew Ernest before I left for the Slade, but only by virtue of attending a conference that we organised. And I can't really remember the subject of it. But,
okay, well, not an invention of problems conference, or
it could have been. It could easily have been. But I was a student then, but I went to it because I was quite interested to see what it was all about. But I didn't actually know Ernest on a personal basis then. And then, so I joined Ernest at Leicester, and then I really was making computer art then between 1974 and 84. And I stopped making computer art, but much of the kind of processes that I actually employed, I then continued in my later work.
Great. So we now have Steve in Leicester going to Malcolm Hughes's department, and then you were the first in what was like a little bit of a pipeline, if that's the way to describe it, of people coming from the experimental group to Leicester to study. I'm looking at both of you to make sure I get this all right.
Yeah. The point I would make is that hard to understand it today. So please forgive me that this sounds strange, but in the early days, if you did the drawings with computers, they were done with lines. It's called vector graphics. Lots and lots of lines. And then we moved to using pixels, like we do all the time today. And Steve's work was really important in recognising what a big difference this made. And that moving from the vectors to the pixel-based work led to a completely different opportunities for artists. I think that was a yeah, that was my favorite. It was, yeah.
And
I wanted to mention that. Yeah, very.
I found a lovely old drawing in a paper that you wrote at Leicester Poly, late 70s, which showed how a screen and a pen, light pen, connect to the computer at the front end, which then connects to the mainframe behind the scenes. So again, you had this interactive system. I'll dig out the picture for you. It's quite good. And then within the exhibition, we have two panels. So we have this work here, which was the, I call it the green lines, but am I right in calling it that?
It's green noise.
Green noise. Which you might briefly say something about.
Yeah. This was quite a late piece, I guess. Sean's got some of the work, some of my plots, which, can look at. And the V&A have got 17 of them. So if you want to look there, it's in the British Computer Art Society, British Computer Art Collection at the V&A. And this was a kind of experimental program, actually. And basically, so this space can be populated with lines, and the lines are then disturbed really by noise. So they're kind of knocked off direction. They head off in the direction which is largely determined randomly, and then they get knocked off the direction they're going in by the noise that's actually occurring. And you could populate it in different ways. So obviously they've been largely populated in a kind of diagonal line, and they're all heading off from there. That's basically the underlying kind of idea of that particular piece, of that work.
Yeah. And then we have some more recent work, which I was very happy that you included. It's probably, from my perspective, your digital work was clearly only part of your practice as an artist, and you've gone off and you're a painter and this, that, and the other. But I was really quite pleased to see you returning to something which had a sense of being more algorithmic, process-driven, and abstract. And these new pieces of work are along that line. You say, how many of you? 160, 150 you produce now?
I started off a series of work where I started with an 8-inch square panel, 3 pens of different colour, and then 3 sectors. So I like to set up constraints and then work within those constraints. So this is part of a series. There are 9 images in the series. So this is the first and the last in the series. There are 9 sectors, as you can see, and there are 9 colours. And so if you take the first one, yellow, in the, let's say, the vertical direction, all of the, although it may not be clearly visible there, but all of the sectors have yellow vertical lines running in them. So there's a kind of background colour, which is the yellow. And then the other 9 colours are drawn over the top. And then the colours are rotated. So this is it goes from yellow to red. So the red is the last in the series. And it's the same kind of approach. You can see in the top left-hand corner, because they're red, both the vertical and horizontal lines are red. And then as far as the others are concerned, you've got red underneath with a chrome yellow. So what I like about these, I never know what it's going to look like. So the rules determine what I'm going to do, and then I just do it, and then I'll find out what it looks like. And that, I think, has been fundamentally always what I've been interested in, which is surprising myself, which I actually found sometimes I could never surprise myself. If I kind of worked in an intuitive way, I couldn't surprise myself, because I just thought, actually, I'm making things symmetrical, or I've got a diagonal line going from bottom to left. Why? Because this is all kind of what you learn when you actually look at the history of art and so on. So my aim always is to surprise myself. And you don't do it very often. But I never know what they're going to look like, and I'm always surprised by what they look like.
So you have a great example there of what I would call computation. Would you be happy with the term computational? Because there is a process.
Yeah, it's definitely a process.
Yeah.
It's determined by a process.
But it's not there's not digital art,
Not digital,
but it has a process that you could write a program to do this process, but you're doing it by hands.
but it wouldn't have the errors in it, which I quite like.
And the realization of the work.
The kind of variability. I mean, I just like, I kind of work, I like material and I like the slowness of the process because it stops me from thinking too quickly. If I think too quickly, I almost always go in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
I quite like to be slowed down.
And that's a good example of why I stick with this term Leicester Computer Art History Pioneers, because the computer actually is not just a digital device. A digital computer is a computer, but a human being can be a computer as well. In fact, the original term computer described a job title, a computing pool, like a typing pool of people who were able to compute, solve problems. And so the computer originally was called the electronic computer, distinguish it from the person who was called the computer. So computer art for me allows us to go beyond just using digital tech, because the ideas are relevant even if the technology is not purely digital. So let's move on to some of the other artists featured. Dominic Boreham, a very interesting character who joined you at Leicester Poly in the sort of let's say mid-70s. Dominic sadly is no longer with us. I managed to make contact with him just before he passed away, but we never got to meet. So that was always a disappointment. But his work is particularly interesting, I think. Again, what you might call his digital work generated by writing programs and running it on a computer, was really part of his history. And I think you would position him for a lot of his career in the idea of a constructivist artist. And work like this, earlier work, clearly it's constructed according to rules. This isn't just a random set of colours. It's like a sequence, blue squares in a grid of 3x3 and other colours and so on. Whereas this clearly is maybe a bit more computer-like. This was generated using a plotter, and the plotter's able to draw these really narrow lines. Maybe has different sorts of mistakes to the sorts of mistakes Steve's talking about, but even computers make mistakes. What I love about computer work on paper is that it's never perfect. You look at it with magnifying glass and the line's a bit wobbly and the plotter wasn't quite right. It does have soul to it. It's not just bigger. So we have some great work by Dominic. And this is Dominic at the Slade, actually. I don't know, Steve, if this room rings any bells. No, but I think it's in the Slade there. And then at the Slade, but then came to Leicester to continue his research and development. So we ended up with this lovely connection. I call it the pipeline of people from the innovative course down at the Slade, Malcolm Hughes, coming up to Leicester. So we were very lucky to have people coming to Leicester under Ernest's tutelage.
Dominic, actually, he went to the Royal College of Art, the design research group there, with George Mullen, to start his PhD. And then I recruited him to Leicester, and I became his external supervisor from the Royal College. So the Royal College was connected with us too.
I think I read somewhere.
It was worth saying, if you look at the second work of art, he was deeply interested in perception. And people like Richard Gregory were very important to him. Because they dealt with some of the issues psychologically that he was trying to deal with as an artist. Yeah.
And I just noticed my friend Matt, or both Mazes, chatting there. This has a great look. I guess I'm aside now. So friend Maz went for an exhibition at in Ipswich or Norwich, yeah. And it was an exhibition of constructivist artwork, and a piece in this series was on the wall. And Maz sent me a text saying, "I've just seen this artwork. I've been staring at it for hours. It's a fantastic piece." And I said, "Oh yeah, that's Dominic Boreham. He was in Leicester for quite a few years." So you get these lovely little connections popping up.
Sure. That's good. Because obviously I know you're big on terminology.
And I never hear the term generative art when you talk about art, and I feel like that's the term that's like trendy now.
That's probably why I don't use it. Yeah.
Yeah, probably. But where would you place that in terms of?
Well,
Is it
well, this is a big issue, and one that we'll discuss in this follow-on project that I want to talk about, but it's a very important one. So to me, generative art means that at the heart of the artwork is a process, and that process is defined by rules. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a computer acting those rules. Like Steve's work demonstrates, you can have a generative process. The images are generated by you following a set of rules, whatever, and the work emerges. And the problem is that the word generative is often misused now. It's almost become a shorthand for a particular style of artwork that actually may not even be generative, but it looks as if it was generative. We're looking at this little follow-on project. It's going to happen in December, January. And one of the things we're trying to do, well, I'm trying to do as part of it, Sean Carroll, whose project it is, might have a slightly different view, but I want to educate people into what it means to have a generative artwork. So I don't tend to use the term because I don't think people necessarily understand it. I would like to have I'd like to introduce what I mean by it. But then saying that, it's a very relevant term, and I'm very happy that people are talking a lot more about generative art, because I think it will open, hopefully, their minds to looking at other artworks and understanding that this generative process doesn't just involve computers, it involves the process, the rules, and all those sorts of things. But yeah, I would say I haven't got a fundamental issue with the use of generative art, and I think almost everything shown here is generative in some sense, in the sense I understand it.
Noting that, however, people use it as if it's a new term. I mean, Fred and I are using the term generative art in the mid-60s.
Yeah,
right.
Now it's involved.
Which is brilliant, and it reinforces that point that there was a terminology and a style of artwork which did involve computers, but not exclusively. 50, 60 years ago, that's relevant to now. Without a doubt, if you think you're a generative artist, learn your history and you'll be a better generative artist, because there's a lot of history to learn. Okay, so that was a brief discussion of Dominic's work. What I would say here is that we are talking to his widow, and the hope is I would love to have a Dominic Boreham exhibition here in Leicester in a few years' time of all the original pieces, which of course are much bigger and more detailed than the examples we're showing downstairs. We do have 2 donated very high resolution copies, but as good as you can get copies. And I think there's a chance that I'll have 1 or 2 of those on display in January here in Leicester when we start to talk about Sean's project. So a great figure there. And then we move on now to the final 4. Brian, I don't think Brian's with us, and I can't see him waiting, which is not a problem. He's recovering from knee surgery. I think maybe the same operation that you had, Ernest. Yeah. So Brian is I've met him a few times. He's a great person to have a chat with, very enjoyable company. But he actually comes from Leicester. Not born in Leicester, but grew up in Leicester, born in Suffolk. And this is a picture of him in his uniform at Sileby Senior School. I guess that's going to be the 50s. It's not quite that old. It's born in 40. Yeah, so yeah, it's going to be late 50s. Now, I met Brian and became an admirer of his work well before I realised he had a Leicester connection. But he did his initial education here in Leicester, in the area, before going off to various other universities, including the Royal College of Art. And he developed a reputation as he's not here to correct me. Others who know him might say the same, digital and conceptual artist. So he used digital technology, but also his work was highly conceptual. He also has a big interest in pataphysics, which is this sort of thing above metaphysics that I really don't get, but apparently it's very interesting. And he's well known within that circle. And I've met, I've met Brian on a number of times, and I discovered something early on in our meeting, which is I had already come across his work before I even knew about him being an artist, because of books like this. So the next prop. So this was published in 1981, and I happened to be at secondary school. And this was an introduction to computers, and Osborne published a lot of these sorts of books, and I love them because I've never been a great reader. So they're not jam-packed full of text, but they got lots of great pictures. And within this book, within this one, he's really introducing us to what is a computer and some of the core concepts behind computing and how they're made. They're made out of valves, apparently, and things like that. We've got what I love here is the speed at which computing technology has changed. That valve was replaced by a transistor, and Apple were talking about their new chip a couple of days ago in an exhibition launch, and I can't actually. I think there were hundreds of millions, if not billions, of these transistors in the cross section of a human hair in their latest chip. It's almost unimaginable to think how we've changed over time. So anyway, so when I was at school, I was reading this. You mentioned valves. But when I revisited this book, I managed to get hold of a copy. Brian's also given me some of the other books for the archive. I discovered there's a picture of a robotic artwork in there called the Sensor. Now, the Sensor is a very important piece in computer arts history because it was a large robot powered by a computer that appeared to have a personality. And in fact, because it didn't have a personality, what it had was a set of simple rules that when they were applied in the movement of this machine, gave you, the viewer, the sense that this machine was somehow sentient or aware of its environment. Very important step in both the development of AI, but also the development of computer art. So I was aware of the Sensor before I even knew it was a Sensor. And then a bit later on in this book was a lovely picture here. I don't know if some of you here knew him, ever saw this. There's computer and art. So, of course, Brian, being an artist, wanted to make sure that everyone knew that a computer could be used for art as well. And that is a drawing of Howard Cohen. I don't know if you've seen this, Ernest, who knew Howard well. You've got to have a closer look at it. And I think, have you, Steve? You must have met Howard Cohen a few times. No, you didn't. Well, I was lucky enough to meet him towards the end of his life. And he wasn't quite as hairy as that when I met him. But that's definitely him. And that's him using his drawing robot to create artworks. Now, Howard is increasingly recognized as maybe one of, if not the first, digital art master. I think if anyone's going to be seen as a sort of master of the form in the future, it's probably going to be Howard. He's certainly got a good marketing team behind him as well. So Brian wrote this book. I happen to have a nice copy of it, introducing me to exciting computer things, including computer art. So who knows, the subliminal impact of Brian Reference-Smith on me may have been very significant. You can have a look at that if you want to look at the pictures afterwards. But here we have a couple of his images. So Brian, we have another version of this, often revisits forms from previous works. They have a conceptual element to them, which I don't necessarily always understand. But we have a lovely, nice Leicestershire-related one here, which is one of his painting by numbers series of a packet of Walker's crisps. And I think it might even be specifically cheese and onion or something. Salt and vinegar. There we go. So I thought that's great that we've got a Brian Reference-Smith piece in the exhibition, and it has a sort of Leicester angle to it. You'll see a lot of his sort of more recent work explores this idea, this sort of painting by numbers, but absurdist, because it'll often have a painting by numbers grid and the only color is black. So if you followed the rules, so it's rule-based, and colored everything in according to the palette you're provided, you just end up with a black square. So, it's definitely very interesting stuff. And Brian has done a lot of work over the years and has been recognized accordingly, Leicestershire-based. Let's move on to Graham, who I think is with us at the moment. And Graham did say that he didn't want to say anything. He's not 100% well at the moment. So hopefully, unless he sort of waves at me in some way, I'll just speak for him. So Graham was at Leicester Poly, De Montfort University, I think at that sort of crossover period, amongst other places. And he's contributed a couple of really quite interesting images here. This earlier one, which is a progression, you'll see, if you can't really maybe see on there, but you'll see that this actually takes you on a progression through the images. I think it's in this serpentine way, which coincidentally is how I often structure my images. I like zigzags rather than sort of horizontals and verticals. And we have this piece here, homage to Ellsworth Kelly, an artist you may recognise. And then we have another piece here, which really are stills from a video, a very slow running video, in the sense that it would take a very long time to watch it. And you might not really notice a lot of changes happening. But that's often a theme within generative and digital work, that you don't have to operate on a time scale that's just about delivering the whole thing in one go. You have a piece here, which again, I think you read in a zigzag of this progression through color combinations and so on. This probably is a piece where, as we develop our collection, we ought to be including videos of the work, and there are videos online to make sure that we can show it and represent it in future. So we have Graham, another DMU stroke Leicester Poly person. Brian there. And then the final two. Now, Steve and Bell, this first person here, is online. So what I'm thinking, Steve, I might briefly stop the share. And if you want to say anything, make yourself known to me. Otherwise,
yeah, I'd be quite happy to. I thought I might share a bit of stuff if that's possible. If you can let me share the screen.
okay.
Is there really? Yeah. What would be?
Okay, well, now I know there. What I'll briefly say is that, so Steve connects into this sort of narrative slightly later in the 80s. And this was after a period where the research group that Ernest led, Steve was involved in, Dominic was involved in, Stroud. Was Stroud officially involved in your group, or was he associate?
The one that moved.
Yeah. But he certainly didn't involve in the move. And moved up the A6 to go to Loughborough University. Lots of reasons behind that. I think an offer you couldn't refuse, I guess. I don't know. I won't go into that. So doing this work in Leicester, now moved up to Loughborough, which was handy for me because that's where I sort of got involved. So this is Steve, and Steve's got a couple of works in the exhibition. And I think I also let him explain that. So Steve, I'm going to stop my share, and if you want to briefly share
Yeah, before you do that, is there any chance you can turn the camera so I can just see the audience? It would be nice just to say hi to people.
what I'm going to say is that there's a risk that by doing this, I end up losing the connection. Or maybe I should have said that.
Oh, right. Well, be careful. Just hold up a mirror. I'll just imagine
that's right,
some wonderful people there. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to struggle. I've got a strong sense of foreboding if I'm.
Yeah, risk. Okay, right.
But I'm going to take a picture, and you can have a look. Take a couple of pictures.
Oh, that's nice. Lovely.
I've taken those.
Cool.
So I'll share. Yeah. So if you want to share anything, you feel free.
Right. Okay. Let's share the right screen. Hopefully that's coming through.
So I can see. Okay. I have to. I knew this was going to be difficult. I have to unpin myself or something. I'll go into. Oh no, speaker. Okay, I don't see you sharing yet. Actually,
I've just got to let my computer allow it. Okay. It asked me to quit later. I'll try it anyway.
Maybe I'll say as a little bit of the intro is that you came to Loughborough to work with Ernest as a artist with a pre-existing practice. You'd already been a practitioner.
That's right. Yeah. I was previously at the University of Canterbury. I was at the Slade. I mean, this common thing. I'm one of the sort of Hughes pipeline, because I was doing a residency at the University of Kent, and I'd previously been at the Slade. And I'd heard that Dominic, who was my contemporary, had gone somewhere or other to do a PhD. I was getting to the end of my I'm just seeing if I can start my video so people actually see me. That's better. That's nicer. Yeah. I'd heard I was getting to the end of the residency, and felt, what can I do next? I want to go do next. I remember Dominic had actually gone to do this PhD, so I got in touch with Malcolm. Said to Malcolm, hey, I've heard that there's this possibility of doing a PhD, and I wanted, I'd been working in computing labs. I was concerned about getting access to computers because you know, at the time it wasn't easy. I kept on going through, this was in the mid 80s. I kept sort of thinking I'm not necessarily going to be able to afford or get hold of computers. How can I get into another lab? Because I was at computing lab at University of Kent. Malcolm told me about Ernest. I got an interview. I came up to Leicester for my interview and was totally freaked out by having to go up in a paternoster in the building at the. I'd had nightmares about paternosters as a kid, having seen them. And anyway, I was in a very strange mood, but somehow I managed to get accepted as a student and ended up. It coincided with the move to Loughborough, so I ended up starting in Loughborough. But I lived in Leicester, lived on Humberston Road and Mandela Street, and went to the Rock Sock at the university and things like that. It was good fun. Right, what I'm just going to say is very quickly about what I thought. There's a piece in the show called Miranda, and I thought I'd just show you how it was made very quickly, as can share the screen. So when you see the actual print of Miranda, it looks a bit like this, and it was based. The way I make the work, I'm just going to I generate the shapes, which I'll show you how I do, and then I I record what I'm doing, and then move through the shape that's been generated until I find a kind of archetypal view that suits what I think's interesting. It's rather like moving through a landscape. And in this case, because Sean had asked me to do a piece a new piece, and also something I'd done whilst I was in Leicester, I thought the one I did from Leicester, which you can see behind me now, is called Prospero and Caliban, using the system I had at the time. And I thought I'll do one called Miranda using a similar technique.
We can't.
So
I can bring it up in a minute. Yeah.
Sorry?
We can't see you, but I can bring it up in a minute. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. I thought you might be able to see it. Right. Okay. So you can see my screen though, yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it on the background, yeah. Okay, so this is a little bit, in the process of making it, I use my software, which is based on a system called Small World that I developed when I was started developing when I was at the University of Kent. But I was able to actually get to do it. I could only produce static images there. When I got to Loughborough, I was working alongside Jonathan Walden, who was doing virtual reality research there at the time. So I was able to use the kit that he actually used for his early research. So I got to use these silicon graphics machines to prove work. I now use an iMac, and I generate these shapes are like trails of creatures that are moving around. In this case, they're bees, and they're trying to get to flowers, these white dots. I'm actually interacting with it, and I exhibit work either static, either animated, or you get the chance to actually use this software to make stuff. And when I'm using it myself, hacking it, basically hacking the code, running it to see what happens. And then I run the thing. You'll see when it starts running, it will start coming up with a comment tree. Here's me locating start points for these entities before they move around. I'll just scrub it along a bit because I want you to be able to go and have a look at the work. So here it's giving me a feedback on what's happening as I go through, do a bit of editing, try again, put some things in, kick the thing running, and off it goes, creating shapes. So I thought I'd use that opportunity just to show you how I make the things. Yeah.
And an interesting thing here is that on a couple of occasions I said, do you think this image is a bit dark? You know, I can't really see it that clear. I printed it off for the exhibition, and I still said, do you think it's a bit dark? But I looked at it, and over time, it started to emerge. So, and that's what you were after. You didn't want something that was so in your face that you get it straight away. So,
no, one of the things as well is I think I mentioned to you, the aesthetic when I do a print, I think of it as a print, and the aesthetic of that particular piece was based, the dark areas and so on is probably influenced by my love of Aubrey Beardsley's work, having large areas of darkness. So, but I was playing with having the light source in the middle of the shape when I was doing this work back in when I was in Leicester. And so I thought I'd try that again with the software I'm currently using. And it was great fun doing it. And I'm very pleased. I just wanted to say thanks for doing this, because I've just learnt from my fellow artists in the exhibition a lot about their work that I didn't know before. And one of the things that's very interesting that could be traced is this sort of reference to organic that came out. There were quite a few of us at the Slade doing that kind of life-based stuff. And there's obviously a pattern to it.
I think other Slade people, obviously Steve has just had to leave us, had an interest in living systems, and I think Paul Brown as well. His work.
Yeah, there was certainly a thing where there was an interest in the game of life. People used to say to me, "Why don't you use fractals?" And I said, "No, I don't. I want to create a system that's my own and new." And that's what I did. I created this small world software which is based on behavioral animation. It's interactive. And it's about interaction, because it's about the aesthetics of the social interaction of individuals, if you like. There's a lot to say about it, but great to be in the exhibition and nice to be able to. I hope everyone enjoys looking at it. There's some great work in it.
And we'll talk to you over the next few months as well about your work. I think it'd be nice to some more insights from you.
Thanks. Okay. I do have to go now, so I'll say cheerio and hope all goes well.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. So,
yeah, I'm aware. I say to everyone, "Oh, we'll finish in an hour," and I think I should just say we're going to finish in an hour and a half. And, right. So let's finish off a quick run through the artworks here. So one last artist, I've included myself. I don't think every time you create an exhibition, you should include yourself. Now, I don't, that's not a good practice for a curator. But I think it's valid to put me in as a pioneer, because I was lucky enough to work with some of the people we've heard about in the late 80s. And that makes me second generation pioneer, maybe third, but, I fit within the pioneers. And for me, what is interesting is that when I was at Loughborough University in the late 80s, I was working with a very creative group of people led by Ernest and Steve, but I was not at the point where I felt I was an artist. I was a computer scientist interested in user interaction and graphics. I didn't see myself as an artist, but clearly something rubbed off on me, because my career changed in the 90s. I progressively moved towards the arts. So I think that's an important thing. Creative computer departments should be creative places, and their output may well be artists, not just computer programmers, certainly in the world we live in now. So I'll explain. There's a bit about my background. So as mentioned, I started in Loughborough in the late 80s doing a computer studies degree. I set up my own business and this, that, and the other. I was very involved in the early internet, but it became clear to me that my trajectory was predominantly heading towards the arts. So I did a master's in the 2000s and eventually finished my PhD, which Ernest supervised me for in the sort of 2010s. And I've included a couple of pieces really, which show where I was maybe definitely before I started my research, both at master's and PhD level, which was in terms of creating what I would call interactive spaces. Perhaps if I'd known about Stroud at the time, I might have cited Stroud as an influence there, or maybe I would have used him as an influence. But I sort of ended up having gone through a process where I was really trying to find my own creative voice and understand what it was I was interested in exploring. And I realized interactivity itself is interesting, but with works like this, which I think I'm happy with this work, collaborative work with Roman Munder, a writer and video maker, the things that interested me were the slightly more abstract elements of that. What does it mean for patterns to emerge from interacting rules? How does interactivity change something? Like I say, interactivity has to change something in a permanent way, I think. If you interact with an object, interact with an artwork, it should never be the same again. And I sort of got to a point during my research with this image here where, and this is a separate conversation, the principles I was interested in could all be represented in this live image. It's not a static image. It's a interaction. So I would say that my work in the late 80s, my fortuitous meeting with Steve and Ernest, really led to a position where, ironically, or not ironically, simply obviously, my image making sits within that sort of canon. You recognize some of Steve's stuff in there. You certainly recognize some of Ernest's, and so on within my image making. So I've got a couple of images in the show. I'm aware that I've been going on for a little while, and I wanted to make sure I covered the additional point, which is about where this exhibition is going. So if I can flip back to, I understand some people may have to head off, but I promise 15 minutes, and you can have some more wine afterwards. I'll even get some more bottles if we've drunk up. So that was the exhibition, and we talked to some of the artists and looked at all the artworks. So a few things here, and this is relating to how this is going to develop as a project. Now, I've already mentioned this, but making connections to me is very important. The idea that the artwork and the art within this collection is connected in different ways. Now, some of those connections are slightly more obvious and sort of they jump to the front. They're sort of the tradition of us connected with Ernest Edmonds and doing work with his department and with people he's worked with, and therefore some of his ideas have been carried through this particular showing of the collection. But there are other connections as well. Leicester has a big tradition of experimental music, and the name Gavin Bryars popped up earlier. I think Steve mentioned Gavin Bryars. I am completely aware I haven't dealt with music from the 70s, and there is some really important music, as well as more contemporary work. So that has to be looked at. The lack of female representation within this history. Now, I don't tend to hunt around to find representatives of whatever needs to be represented for the sake of it, but I am positive that women were involved in this story. It's just I haven't come across those stories. So I'm very interested to have anybody who's got more information to present that to me. So other connections. I also want to see this project lead up to the present day. I'm focused very much on pre-2000, so I think we can get away with calling that history, but there's loads of post-2000 stuff as well that we need to incorporate. So how are we going to move this project forward? Well, first of all, I was very excited to get the support from the City Council, Cultural Ambition Fund. That has enabled us to get to this point. I now want to move forward. I most definitely want Leicester's Heritage Department website to feature digital artwork. I want digital art heritage to be seen as something that Leicester has and we should celebrate. So one of our measures of success is, after this exhibition's been going for 3 months and all these meetings, is that we are on the Leicester Heritage website as Digital Art City. You know, a lot of it happened here and a lot of it is still happening. So engagement with the council, let's see how that goes. More engagement with the institutions. So we've looked at universities, De Montfort University / Leicester Poly in particular, but there's work at Leicester University which needs to be looked at as well. And then, of course, the grassroots stuff, the stuff that didn't happen in universities, or that may have involved people who came out of the universities and stayed in the city. So there's plenty of work to be done exploring the histories. And then one really exciting thing is that I've been talking to the archive at De Montfort University, and they're interested in taking this collection and other collections within the Computer Arts Archive, storing them in the proper environment and making them available to people who want to do research. And I'd like to think over the coming year, if we're lucky, do I have a representation of the archive here? I don't know if they're able to make it. I will be talking, I'll be talking to them. We're talking about a 10-year project. So I think any archive needs 10 years to do anything with. I'd be happy to work with the archive at the university, and this has been involved in making this happen, so that we have a great collection or materials go into it and we can start doing research into our history. So I think that's an exciting thing about what's going to happen next. And then in the very short term, something that's going to happen next, well, Phoenix also, I think, needs to be a partner of that. So we need to ensure Phoenix continues to be involved in the presentation of this work. And then the next thing is a project that is being called New Generations, that Sean Carroll has managed to get Arts Council support for. Few fortuitous things happened to come together. I had this concept for an exhibition called New Generations, which would be fresh interpretations of this work, but I hadn't got any funding for it. So it was just sitting there as a project I would like to do. And then Sean came along, so I've just got some funding to do engagement with sort of computer art. And I was going to do games, but actually I think it might be really interesting to do, in quotes, generative art terms there. And we've worked out between us, I think, a really interesting schedule over the next few months, where we'll be offering opportunities for some local artists to learn more about this work and start creating their own work, hopefully inspired by this. We'll be running workshops for broad engagement. And then something I'm always keen on doing, we'll be looking at turning it into resources for educating young people. I have a concept which I've run in my teaching for maybe a year and a half, almost 2 years, called Images in the Style of, where I take a digital artist and I write a Scratch program to simulate their image. Scratch is a really easy to use programming environment. We're going to turn that into a proper education module that can be taught as part of an arts award. So arts award is an opportunity for people, it's young people only, is it only young people, or can it be anyone of any age? I think it is under 25s, but particularly smaller ones, yeah.
Anyone can do it, but you can
Yeah. And so we'll be able to offer a module which will help them towards their arts award about generative computer artwork with a good Leicester mix. So I'll be talking to all of the artists about how they can inform on that. We hope, in fact, no, I'll say we will have, because it's in the diary. We will have an exhibition in January of some of the original pieces from these artists, together with work that's been inspired by them, by the contemporary artists. You call it a boot camp. They haven't got a lot of time to start creating new work, but they will get support in doing that. So by the end of January, this exhibition will happen over at LCB, and it will look at historic work, but as a way of encouraging people to look at contemporary practice, their own practice. To me, it's like, that's exactly what it should be about. History, like I've said before, is not about nostalgia. It's about learning from and making sure you as an artist, or you as somebody who wants to appreciate art, are better informed. So it seems like already we're starting to get a bit of traction behind this project. I'd like to feel in future, as we uncover more narratives, we get additional support, we have more exhibitions. I'm expecting people to get in touch with me and say, oh, but you haven't included this person, why aren't I included, and so on. That's exactly what I want. If nobody came back to me, I think, well, I can't have got everyone in one go. I know I haven't. So I'm looking forward to getting more feedback. So I think as a final point then is to say thanks very much for coming along. Try and enjoy the exhibition downstairs. It's on for 3 months, so you can come back whenever you fancy. Keep an eye out for some of the additional activities that we're going to arrange. You know, if everyone here, clearly there's an interest, but by the end of our 3-month period, if everyone here felt that they knew about this history and knew what some of these artists were attempting to achieve, I'd feel like it was work well done.